All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the first webinar of the Chinese American Scholars Forum. My name is Chuan He. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago, and I will serve as the moderator for today's webinar. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Brian Sun to be the first speaker of this webinar series. I'll take a couple minutes to briefly summarize the motivation of this forum and the webinar series. In the past couple years, the entire Chinese American professor or scholar community have seen concerning cases brought up across the country that appears to target this particular community, at least based on the number of cases and the scrutiny brought towards this community. One of the most recent cases is, of course, the criminal charge against the Professor Chen at MIT, but there have been a number of other cases. Many of us thought a forum that coordinates existing professional associations of Chinese American scholars is necessary in order to offer a platform to better communicate and inform our community about rules from federal agencies and universities that some of us may not be fully aware of. This could also serve as a bridge to better communicate with relevant federal agencies to perhaps avoid misunderstanding and hopefully clarify about the academic freedom that has driven innovation and scientific advance in this country. And importantly, as many of you are concerned about, we hope this forum will also help provide necessary legal consultation and legal help needed for members of this community. In fact, you'll hear from Brian, and Brian and others are working to come up with a list of lawyers in major cities that members from our community can contact when you need a professional legal consultation. Now, this open forum is about getting information, answering questions, and offering help. It will be transparent, and we plan to invite also representatives from different government agencies and individual scientists who have unfortunately and unfairly suffered the litigation process. I want to say this is not a place to ask for private legal consultation. For that, you should contact your lawyer. My job is actually easy today, but a lot of people devoted countless time and efforts to make this happen. I really want to thank all of them. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Brian Sun to be our first speaker. Brian is an American trial lawyer and partner of the law firm Jones Day in the area office. Brian went to the University of Southern California for his undergrad studies and obtained his JD from University of Southern California. Brian has had a decorated career. He successfully defended several espionage and foreign government influence cases and white-collar criminal cases. A notable one for this community is the case of Li Wenhe. Without further ado, I'll turn the forum to Brian. Brian, please.
Thank you very much, Professor He. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. I'm told we have almost 1,000 people here. It's amazing what the technology will allow these days. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight about a subject that's actually very, very close to my heart and many others who have been touched by the subject we're talking about, which is namely the US government's increasing number of investigations of Chinese American academics, researchers, folks who work largely in American research institutions and educational institutions, and who are impacted by what we have referred to as the Department of Justice's so-called China initiative, which I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Now, the purpose of the talk, as Professor He said, is, look, I'm not here to give you a lot of legal advice, although you're going to hear me go into some do's and don'ts about how you can maybe avoid getting into trouble. It'll be sort of, in some respects, we're going to do like in a medical analogy. I'm a lawyer here, but I'm here to try to make sure you don't get sick. I'm here to try to tell you what the symptoms are of how you could get sick in this area and how to avoid it, or at least prepare yourself in a way where you can avoid some calamity. And I always like to say, for those who have seen me talk before, if you ever see me again, you know you're in trouble unless you're seeing me on a webinar. So you hope don't ever want to see me in a legal context, because you probably can't afford me. So with that, I want to get into the program itself, which I don't know why I'm not able to do that right now, but my thing is not letting me move my program for, there we go. So this is organized by a bunch of folks in the Chinese American community, various groups from professional educators and academics. The subjects we want to cover tonight are first from a historical context of how did we get here? The Chinese American experience. Some of you may know some of this, some of you may not. Be talking about historical racism against Chinese Americans, a benchmark incident in Chinese American history in more modern times, the murder of Vincent Chen and Dr. Wenho Lee's case. Then I'm going to want to talk a little bit about sort of the background here of what it is that the China Initiative is all about. Why is the United States government, why is the United States Department of Justice interested in pursuing Chinese American academics in the interest of national security? And we're going to talk about that and the government's concerns, their assumptions, their perceptions, and how it crosses with what could impact you. Then I'm going to do, going back to my medical analogy, some of the self-diagnostics, some of the things you can look for, things that come up in these cases that could in fact happen to you, honestly, or some friend, acquaintance, or colleague that you would want to be vigilant for the statutes, the criminal statutes the government's using, and how to investigate and prosecute and indeed criminalize conduct that professors and academics would never probably thought would be criminal conduct. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is going to be an overarching theme in tonight's talk, which are the perceptions of Chinese Americans in America today, and the perceptions that perhaps we as Chinese Americans are not as loyal as other Americans, that we have some kind of special allegiance or bond to China, the motherland, as some FBI agents would call it, and how it is we can address and deal with that. And then talk about the contributions we have made that make us, and when you talk about making America great, how Chinese Americans helped to make America the great country it is today. And finally, what you can do to try to take that message home to your employers, to the schools you work with, and to the other leaders of our country to say, hey, we deserve better treatment than we're getting under the China Initiative. So let's go to it. We start this program with the notion that there is a perception by the United States government that the Chinese government is sponsoring huge amounts of economic espionage and in systemic ways trying to steal America's technology in a whole number of spaces. And as it competes more with America, not as a copycat country making products and selling them cheap abroad, but competing with America in some of the most hottest areas of innovation and technology. And why is this important? Because there are some of us who believe that the next great Cold War, which has already begun, really will not be over how many missiles or nuclear warheads or aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines we have, but really will be battling technology, sciences, life sciences, everywhere from artificial intelligence to bio-life sciences, nanotechnology, whatever. And that's where the battle will be. And therefore, for America, it should be vitally important, if it's going to compete, to keep the smartest and best and the brightest working in America, not going abroad. Pitch that against, or match that against, what the US government says is a big, dangerous effort promoted by the Chinese government under the 1,000 Talents programs, where the national, provincial, municipal, and other forms of Chinese government entities will fund efforts to bring top technology researchers to China to work with Chinese companies, Chinese institutions, the development of the very technologies I just spoke about. Now, and I need to go through this quickly because we don't have a lot of time here, but it's important to understand the context in which all this comes up. When the Chinese people started coming to the United States in the mid-19th century. These are the cartoon caricatures of how they were depicted. Hardly flattering images of Chinese people, immigrants, who, were deprived of the ability to own land, to vote, some of the basic civil rights. And it's very interesting to note that many of the rights that immigrants have today were earned by Chinese immigrants who fought in the immigration courts to get some of the basic fundamental rights that we enjoy today. And that would not have happened if these immigrants hadn't fought to defeat these kinds of images you see on the screen. And even acts where the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited Chinese from coming to the United States, immigrating. And again, one of the themes I talk about in my talks is history repeats itself. There are efforts by the United States government to try to discourage or exclude talented people from China to come to the US to study, such that they're not even feeling welcome to come here anymore. And many of you already feel that pain when you lose some valuable postdocs who want to come study with you, but who may be discouraged by both the Chinese government and the US government from coming here to study. When I say the Chinese American experience is suffered some of these discriminatory acts, history has demonstrated it, and it repeats itself. In the 1950s, after China went communist, there was the Red Scare, where Chinese Americans were subjected to surveillance, harassment, investigations by the FBI because of the specter and threat and fear of communism. Fast forward to the late 1990s during the campaign finance prosecutions, where there was again thoughts that the Chinese were in a sinister way trying to affect the US election process. And I don't know if that sounds familiar to you given the recent goings on involving Russia, but that China was trying to influence the American political process through donations, a lot of hearings, congressional hearings, prosecutions. One of the slides is of me much younger with a lot more hair. Now, a lot of this began in the late 1990s when the US government began to focus on how China was trying to acquire US technology, either through licensing authorized by the Clinton administration or other means that would be able to be used for not just commercial purposes, but military purposes. And this sparked a debate in the late 1990s about, was America doing enough to protect its sensitive technology? This led to a 1999 Congressional Committee report led by Congressman Christopher Cox of California that basically said that the Chinese government had 9,000 front entities working for it to try to steal US technology. And although the evidence supporting that supposition was soundly rejected by many think tanks and other sources, note this is the genesis of the current concern that America has about the theft of technology for military and commercial uses. I wanted to step back for a moment in history to talk about the murder of Vincent Chen. This was the murder of a young Chinese American in Detroit about 40 years ago. It was coincided on June 19, 1982, which is the day that a number of people were murdered, African Americans were murdered in Oklahoma. But Vincent was murdered outside a club in Detroit where he was going to a bachelor party by 3 unemployed Caucasian auto workers who thought he was Japanese, and that they held him responsible for being unemployed because of Japanese car imports. This particular incident helped to galvanize the Chinese American community and helped to lead to the formation of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, NAPABA, and other Chinese and Asian American groups to fight for the civil rights of Asians who were victimized by hate crimes and other sorts of incidents from anti-Asian bias and rhetoric. I want to next talk, before we actually get into the main subject matter, of Dr. Wenho Lee's case, because following the Cox Committee report in 1999, Dr. Lee's case came along. Now, many of you know about it. He's Dr. Li is a former physicist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He was accused of misappropriating classified information with an eye towards giving it to the People's Republic of China. We do not have time to talk about the case other than to remind people that he endured 9 months of solitary confinement. He was detained without bail. And during his bail hearings, the judge was initially inclined to let him out on an ankle bracelet on bail, till the United States attorney told the judge in camera under seal, he said, "Your Honor, you, the life and safety and security of your wife, your daughter, and 280 million Americans will be imperiled if you let this man out of bail, because Chinese agents will, in the middle of the night, exfiltrate him back to China and will never know the damage that he will have done to this country." Well, suffice it to say, about 9-10 months later, the legal team, which did a lot of great work, was able to convince the judge that bail was appropriate, partly because they were able to debunk the government's assertions that any of the information that Dr. Li had allegedly misappropriated was really sensitive, confidential, classified information that could hurt the country. This led to an extraordinary apology by the judge who had detained him 9 months before. He said at his hearing, "I tell you with great sadness, I feel I was led astray. I was sad for you and your family because of the way in which you were kept in custody while you were presumed under the law to be innocent of the charges the executive branch brought against you. It is only the top decision makers in the executive branch. They did not embarrass me alone. They have embarrassed our entire nation and each of us who is a citizen of it." And I can tell you, I was in the courtroom that day and you could have heard a pin drop. There were reporters weeping. One of the prosecutors was weeping. That's how dramatic this apology was from Judge Parker. And he says, "As I indicated, I have no authority to speak on behalf of the executive branch, but as a member of the judiciary, I sincerely apologize to you, Dr. Li, for the unfair manner you were held in custody by the executive branch." And I can tell you that for those of us who do criminal law, federal judges do not apologize to criminal defendants. Wenho subsequently sued the government for some of the damages were caused to him and was able to settle not only with the government, but some of the media organizations that led to some of his damages. All right, so let's move on to the national security issues here. I think all of you know that the United States believes, and if you don't know it, get it, that the Chinese intelligence services, the Chinese government, as well as private companies, academic institutions are targeting Chinese citizens and individuals of Chinese descent, Hua Chao, Mei Chao, to try to get inside access to technology. This is the perception of the United States government and its intelligence services. And in fact, the Chinese government has been accused by the US of trying to cyber hack and steal technology using computer technology. They've indicted People's Liberation Army officers for engaging in this sort of conduct. And the victims of this are affected companies are among America's largest companies. And as a consequence, the government launched a series of investigations and prosecutions, even after the Wenho Li case, where they not only went after individuals who they thought were stealing military technology, but technology such as paint formulas, or in one case, supposedly plans for the space shuttle, which, by the way, China has never sought an interest in that. So the cases that have morphed actually since Wenho Li's case have been numerous. They have been pursued during the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and they focus a lot on the theft of technology and information to China for the use of both military and commercial reasons. In some of these cases, the government then, and as they do today, when they charge individuals, will sometimes go to court and assert some very crazy things, not crazy, things that U.S. government believes is important to trying to convince a judge that, like Wen Ho Lee, the defendant should not be allowed out on bail. And this raises the specter of an important issue that predominates this whole topic, which is the theme of loyalty. Are we as Chinese Americans any less loyal than an Irish or a Dutch or a German American or an Italian American? Why are we different? Why are we, given all our contributions to making America great, are we looked upon differently? So in one case involving a former Eli Lilly scientist, Chinese American citizen, kids going to school in Indianapolis, who was arrested for trade secret theft and economic espionage type charges. At his initial bail hearing, the prosecutor goes to the court and says the following: if the superseding indictment in this case could be wrapped up into one word, the word would be traitor. We're talking about an Eli Lilly scientist who had been hired by a Chinese company in the area of cancer drug research, and they called this guy a traitor and sought him to be detained. I can't get into the case, we don't have time, but a year later, the US government, the Department of Justice, dismissed the case completely. And this particular scientist is now working in China. Let me turn to a couple of other quick cases that many of you may have heard of. Chen, a weather hydrologist who was born in China, who lived in the Midwest, was accused of spying for the China, and her charges were dropped before trial when the US attorney realized there was no case, and to his credit, stepped up and dismissed the case before it could actually go to trial. Many of you know the case of the chairman of the Temple University Physics Department, Professor Xiaoxing Shi, or Shi Xiaoxing, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with, who was and featured on a 60 Minutes piece, who was wrongly accused of marketing schematics for some sophisticated laboratory equipment that you probably could have bought at a Walmart. But the inflammatory rhetoric in these cases are pretty much recorded in the record. They claim Professor Shi was doing this to seek prestigious appointments in China. In Chen's case, and because he's a weather hydrologist, that somehow information about dams could be identified, targeted in wartime to cause large losses of life. And in Dr. Zhao's case, the Eli Lilly case, they called him a traitor. To the point where the editorial board of the New York Times looked at these cases and basically took the position that these cases were brought by supposition, and that neither Professor Shi nor Ms. Chen ever got an explanation or an apology. Both Chen, who continues courageously to fight for reinstatement on her job, Professor Shi, who has sought accountability from the FBI on his arrest, are continue to battle and seek justice in their cases. Now let's talk about the China Initiative. It is in fact an initiative that was brought during the Trump administration in late 2018 by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It was an initiative designed and targeting towards cases involving Chinese companies or individuals, entities, institutions involving trade secret theft and educational institutions, and involving and targeting individuals who could be agents of the People's Republic of China. And they also identified a number of other charges they could bring that would support these kinds of investigations that would be designed to stem the flow of valuable American technology to China that was not being done in a lawful way. And the premise of this was the notion you want to stop this technology from going to China because no country, according to FBI Director Chris Wray, no country presents a broader, more severe threat to our ideas, our innovation, and economic security than China. Now, from the China Initiative, I've excerpted this key priority. develop an enforcement strategy concerning what they call non-traditional collectors, meaning researchers in labs, universities, okay, and that are being co-opted into transferring technology contrary to US interests, and to educate colleges and universities about the potential threats to academic freedom and open discourse from influence efforts on campus. So this is the stuff that concerns you, because since the China Initiative was promulgated in late 2018, there have been over a dozen cases involving Chinese Americans in the academic world, where again, the same pattern of allegations recur, and I'll go through them in a minute. But I think one thing I can say to you, that when you look at these cases closely and you look at whether or not any technology was illegally transferred or any meaningful technology given to China in these cases, you're going to find zero in the terms of valuable technology given by these scientists. But the China Initiative has led to a number of incidents, which some of you are already aware of. Down in Texas at the MD Anderson School Cancer Center, 3 Chinese American scientists were dismissed, and a lot of controversy and consternation. And the bottom line there is, one of the lessons that I think, again, are why we need to step up, or you and your community need to step up, the academics, is this notion that Chinese American scientists, because they're subjected to this sort of investigation and persecution, what are they doing? They're being fired, they're being pressured to leave, they're even being told you're not welcome, or they go back to China because that's the only place they can work. And why do we say this is a questionable aspect of the China Initiative? Because the very thing that the US government is concerned about is, of course, national security and the threat of a loss of technology. But what happens here in these cases is the professors feel unwelcome, they've lost their job, and the only place they can go is to China and take their know-how and brain power to China, which is counter to the objectives of the China Initiative. A very sort of sad result of the initiative in the view of many. So they're reputed in reports that there are nearly 200 or more investigations at major academic centers that have resulted in indictments of several professors around the country. There's the case of Franklin Tao at the University of Kansas. Professor Tao is one of the professors who's fighting the US government. I urge you to look into his case. He has a website and a GoFundMe page where you can learn about his fight to take on the US government on some of the prosecution theories that they have charged him with, again, with this basic argument that he, like many of the others who are charged in these cases, have concealed their quote unquote ties to research or academic institutions funded by the Chinese government or 1,000 Talents type program. It's interesting because while virtually the most of these cases involve Chinese Americans, the US DOJ has now shifted gears somewhat in order to counter the racial profiling arguments to going after non-Chinese academics, including Professor Lewis at West Virginia and Charles Lieber at Harvard. And another example is of, again, prominent professor at Emory, Xiaojiang Li, is working in China today because he lost his job at Emory because of the investigation and indictment he went through in his case in Atlanta. Now, to highlighting and illustrate my point about the fact that the China Initiative seems to be at least misplaced with respect to the academics like yourselves, the majority of the academics, is the case of Professor Chen Shui. So many of you know him to be a very well-known scientist from the 1950s. He was a legend at Caltech. They have a statue of him on campus. But because of the Red Scare in the 1950s, the FBI persecuted him, hounded him, made him feel so unwelcome that he left the United States to go to China. Not because he wanted to, but because he felt unwelcome and uncomfortable working and teaching in the country he had adopted and loved. And so what happened? He goes to China and he becomes the father of China's hydrogen bomb. And China benefited from, again, the unwelcome treatment that Professor Chen endured. And this is a lesson in story that, again, I say it again, history is repeating itself. He took China to space. Okay, let's get to the self-diagnostic part of the presentation here. I'm going to give you a quick roadmap of the statutes, some questions to ask yourself to assess your risk, personal risks, some of the cases under the initiative, and some do's and don'ts. Now, in the statute, there's fraud statutes, there's tax-related statutes, and then there are national security statutes that involve mishandling of classified information, classified technology that you should be getting a license for from the US government under the national security stuff. Fraud stuff is interesting because those are government fraud theories where they say you, the professors, are cheating the US government when you take an NIH grant or an NSF grant, take their money and you don't disclose that you have ties to China. Now, what's ultimately ironic is that many of these grants involve investigation and research that are supposed to be made public anyways. So it's not like you're researching and using federal money that is proprietary to anybody in particular. So the government is stretching itself on these fraud statutes. The tax-related statutes are your failure to report money you earn offshore from 1,000 Talents programs or offshore money. You fail to report it on your tax returns, or if you maintain a bank account abroad and you don't report it on your tax returns. These are the common things where the government tries to play what I call gotcha that you didn't do this, and then tries to criminalize it when they don't necessarily have to. So again, some of the checklist questions you ask yourself are you or your employer, and are you working on some grant that's a result of federal funding? Have you disclosed to your employer or your university that you were getting positions or funding from the Chinese government or academic or even a startup that's getting Chinese government money? And are your activities paid for by anybody tied to those entities? And have you disclosed, or do you have any contracts or agreements or written partnerships or collaborations with such entities, including startups, that you haven't disclosed to your employer? Contracts and involvement with startups is a common one. And have you disclosed all of this in federal funding applications? You know, have you ever asked a friend or a colleague or written a stupid Gmail or email asking anybody to not reveal that you've got some ties to the Chinese government? You know, you say to yourself, who would do something as stupid as that? Well, I hate to tell you, many cases like that. I mentioned the case of Professor Tao in Kansas, that he's been accused of failing to disclose a conflict of interest, supposedly because he didn't disclose some ties that he had to China, which, you go on the internet and you find he wrote a lot of articles in the with Chinese related people. So it's not like he was trying to hide it. You find the articles on the internet. Here's an interesting species, a more recent species, where the US government is trying to discourage postdocs from coming to the United States. This lady, Ms. Tang, was charged last year with being a visa fraud, lying on her visa application. She had not served in the People's Liberation Air Force or Army, and they arrested her when she came to the United States for visa fraud. And she was going to do postdoc research at UC Davis in the oncology space. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's this thing called Fbar, foreign bank account reporting requirements. If you got foreign bank accounts, you haven't reported them on your tax returns, you better think about it, because it's a violation, just like it is not reporting income you make abroad maybe from the result of a 1,000 Talents program. Professor Chen at MIT was charged with one of those type of counts. Professor Lee at Emory, the gentleman I talked about earlier, he had a problem because he did not report about $500,000 in income he earned over the years from his foreign 1,000 Talents related work. So these false statements are a very, very big deal. How do you deal with answering these questions? And a lot of people don't think that there is a conflict of interest on these forms they get because they don't think there's a conflict of interest. The technology and research you're doing from a federal grant has nothing to do with your 1,000 Talents work. So a lot of people don't even check these boxes, or were not trained by their institution or the agency that they worked with to check these boxes in a way that the government says is the way you should do it in order to avoid a criminal charge. And so therein lies some of the problems. When these investigations get started, you also have false statements, not just on the forms you filled out, connection with your funding, but you get interviewed by university counsel who represent the school, not you. And the school then takes your statements and gives them to the federal government because they hold the attorney-client privilege, you don't. It's called that, and the university lawyers need to give you what we call an upjohn warning so that you understand that. And a lot of people don't do that or don't understand that when they talk to their own university counsel, the counsel, unless he gives you an upjohn warning, can give what you say to the US government, okay? These are issues that are come up in Professor Lieber's case at Harvard, and there'll be other issues like that from Professor Chung, who's a tenured professor, was at Texas A&M. He's also one of the professors fighting charges right now. Allegations he made false statements and hid his relationships with a Chinese university. And interestingly enough, and tragically, Professor Cheng was arrested in August of last year and is still held without bail. So it's professors like Professor Tao in Kansas and Professor Cheng in Texas who are fighting, mortgaging their homes, doing whatever to fighting for their not only professional life, but for their freedom and safety of their families. There is this statute called FARA, Foreign Agents Registration Act. Bottom line is this is a statute the government is using to try to classify Chinese Americans, particularly being agents of the People's Republic of China in areas involving technology and research. It's an aggressive theory, one that you should talk to your lawyer about if you ever get into trouble about how you can push back on that theory, because none of these cases have shown any connection between these professors and the Chinese government, except through these academic institutions that they have relationships with through the 1,000 Talents program. The US DOJ is saying that's enough to make you an agent of the People's Republic of China, okay? Again, I mentioned earlier, trade secret theft and economic espionage, Export Control Act violations, which involve you having to get licenses and approvals before you can transmit them to anybody in China. You need to make sure you don't violate those statutes. There's an example of a UCLA professor who was charged and convicted of working with a Chinese company that he was president of in exporting semiconductor technology to China. So you really don't want to get on this slide ever. That's my point. By taking some of the precautions that I'm going to talk about now, the do's and don'ts. The do's are, if you're going to talk to a university lawyer, make sure you know that about whose privilege it is, but find out from your in-house lawyer what it is you need to disclose to both the university and the federal agencies. Don't waive attorney-client privilege. Get advice from your in-house lawyer at the university of what you're supposed to do. Make sure your disclosures to the university are also disclosed to your federal funding sources. Disclose any affiliation you have with any Chinese talent program. Disclose any foreign bank accounts you have. Disclose any payments to any Chinese entity or individual that could be income on your US tax returns. Because remember, your US citizens or green card holders, you have to declare all your income worldwide, not just what you make in the US. You have to monitor the status of your Chinese affiliations. Make sure you know what the Chinese side is doing and saying about your relationship with them. Sometimes these Chinese institutions will embellish, exaggerate, or overstate what you're doing with them for their own selfish reasons. And you should monitor that. And these forms that you get from the university, guidelines about disclosure, study them, seek some advice if you have questions about what they mean, so you don't get yourself in the same kind of trouble some of your colleagues have around the country. You also, on the don'ts, don't ask anyone to disclose or hide information. Don't disclose trade secret or proprietary information owned by others to foreign governments or officials. Don't act as a consultant recruiter for the Chinese government. This is where, again, this tricky stuff about getting postdocs to work for you can be a problem. But I had a case years ago in New York where one of the professors had some postdocs working for him, and the government was saying these postdocs were trying to steal stuff, like take pictures of a mock-up in a lab. It turns out the Langone Medical Center medical brochure had better pictures of the same mock-up as these professors took in the case. So go figure. And don't share technology that may require an export license, because that'll get you in trouble. Now, let me talk a little bit about the loyalty issue. Look at what we are perceived by Americans today, okay? At least in cinema. Charlie Chan with white actors playing a Chinese detective. Hop Sing was a cook on the Bonanza series. In James Bond, the Chinese were evil villains. Then there's the martial arts, Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. Year of the Dragon, a movie about Chinese organized crime. And then the latest version of Crazy Rich Asians, where people think we're all just rich people running around with a lot of money. And then bring us up to the modern era. In the last couple of years since the China initiative was promulgated, our most recently departed president added fuel to the fire by calling COVID-19 the Kung flu, the Wuhan virus, and spawned a number of incidents of hate crimes against Asian Americans around the country, for which me and many of my colleagues have to deal with on a regular basis. And then the government was attacking TikTok as a national security threat. Personally, I think it's a security threat to my daughter, some of the content on there, but not military national security. And WeChat, which of course is a platform that many Chinese use. One thing I like to talk about sometimes is Steve Bannon, President Trump's former advisor, who took the position that the murder of George Floyd was China's fault. George Floyd being the murdered African-American in Minnesota, killed by some cops. Bannon would argue that Floyd had COVID-19, which we all know was caused by China. He had fentanyl in his system, which is a drug that China is flooding into the US. He didn't have a job because all the good jobs are being taken up and vanished because of Chinese competition. And he was passing a counterfeit bill that was almost certainly manufactured in China. This is the kind of stuff that the conservative right is spouting about Chinese Americans, against the fact that we as Chinese Americans have more than a legitimate right to say that we make America great as much as any other community. David Ho, Time Man of the Year, pioneer in AIDS research. One of my favorites, Colonel Kurt-Chu Lee, hero in the Korean War, who saved thousands of lives through his actions in Korea. Steve Chu, former Secretary of Energy and Nobel Prize winner. I.M. Pei, the architect. Steve Chen, who co-founded YouTube. Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam Memorial. Jerry Yang from Yahoo. And of course, one guy who has allowed us and allowed me to speak to 900 or 1,000 people tonight, Eric Yuan, who founded Zoom. And I can't be, I would be remiss in not posting this last slide of contributors of my father, my late father, who died this past year, Colonel, United States Army, served in Vietnam, Vietnam vet, Bronze Star winner. This is a guy who risked his life during the Tet Offensive in 1968 as a U.S. Army soldier fighting for America. And yet we have people casting aspersions on our community and calling them traitors because they go work for Chinese companies on drug research. So what's my mantra here, everyone? Don't be stupid. I say this to the government agents in my lectures about go after the bad guys. We have no problem with going after people who steal stuff, but don't be stupid. Do your homework on the science and the technology and then go after them. Don't be stupid. But my mantra about don't be stupid goes for you too as well, because a lot of the professors who've been charged and investigated have done goofy things. Okay, they haven't paid their taxes, whatever. All right, fix it, clean it up. Don't be stupid. And then my last thing I'll say here, as we wrap up for questions, is don't sit on the sideline either. Get involved, okay? Because if you don't get involved, this is what's going to happen to you. Enormous impact to your reputation, career, enormous legal fees, embarrassment to friends, family, professional, loss of tenure in consultancies. And when you have to seek indemnification from your university, you've got to make a lot of noise. You got to step up and get organized, the faculty, and go to your regents, the board of regents, the board of trustees, the people who the administrators have to be accountable to and say, look, back us up like MIT backed up Professor Chen. Okay, you got to do that, get up and make noise about it. Because if you don't do it, you're going to end up being like Professor Tao in Kansas, Professor Cheng in Texas A&M and others who have to rely on GoFundMe links to help them defend themselves because mortgaging their homes isn't going to be enough. Okay, and I urge you to think about that and get involved. Okay, now US scientists are beginning to get organized, not just Chinese Americans, and lobbying the new administration. There's been talk about amnesty, but I can tell you the Department of Justice will say there is no amnesty program, and it remains to be seen whether there will be one. But if you make some noise to your congressman, to the government, to the White House, to the Department of Justice, maybe you'll be heard. And worst case scenario, everyone, if you get in trouble and have to see a lawyer, there are lawyers around the country, and here are some of them, who in Los Angeles, Washington, San Francisco, New York, who have had these cases and who you can turn to if you need help. And they know this stuff and they know it well and can guide you. And there's another organization called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. They are a community legal services organization. They have developed and are developing a referral network of lawyers around the country to help you if you need help. So Asian Americans Advancing Justice is another resource for you to contact and see, hey, can you refer me a lawyer to help? I recently got a call from AAJ to help some lawyers in Boston who are representing a Chinese national who had been charged under the China Initiative, and I was able to help them. So again, this is one of those things where if you work together, you coalesce, you organize, make noise, you can do better. So I just hope you don't, as I said, ever have to see me again except on a webinar. If you do, then you know you're in trouble, and trust me, you can't afford me. Okay, Professor He, I'm done. I hope I ran over a few minutes, but I think we still have time for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Brian. That was great. Yeah, we have about 40 minutes for some questions, and we actually collected lots of questions when our audience registered for this webinar. And we also have questions raised from the online. So I probably will just go through some questions we collected previously from people registered. So Brian, I will start to run a few questions. What should I do with income from China? Do all incomes from China need to be reported to the IRS?
If you're a green card holder or a US citizen and a US taxpayer, the answer is yes. The US IRS says any income you earn in the United States or worldwide is taxable, and you have to report it on your tax return. That's not the case in a lot of other countries, but in the United States, that's the rule.
Yeah, the second question related, would bank account under my name although the money was deposited by a family in China, be dangerous?
Could be, depends on what the purpose was for, whether you have control over the money and it is actually your money. It could be a gift. The question is whether it would be income to you or deductible by whoever gave you the money. A lot of Chinese Americans keep money offshore for the purposes of helping relatives or taking trips and having renminbi, in a Chinese account in China when you're there. But the key here is to report it if it's income. And if you have some questions about whether or not it's income or not, go talk to your accountant.
As far as we don't get any funding support from China, we're off the hook. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. You could still make a false statement to the government on a form that you have ties, not just get that you've gotten money. And so the government could still say you're not being truthful or you're concealing your relationship, which could lead to your giving technology that they think you shouldn't be giving to some Chinese institution. So just because you don't get money doesn't mean you're off the hook.
How should we deal with past history of contacts or contracts in China, such as short-term visits, 2 months a year, usually under the big name, some sort of Chinese program? This kind of visit was not considered as conflict of interest in the past.
Well, you have to always be that you can break that up into two things. One is if you submitted forms historically that were not accurate, then you have to talk to your legal advisor or your university about whether you want to amend those historically inaccurate reports. And then going forward or currently, whether or not you need to disclose it, depending on the regulations of the funding agency that's maybe affecting your answers to the whatever question or your relationship in China. Okay. And again, in this space, it's very interesting because many universities, I would posit to you, have responsibility, some would say even culpability in this process for not training, educating, and even as part of the China initiative, the agencies and the DOJ educating the scientists on how to properly fill out these forms. So it's a thing where even if you find that you historically may have done some inaccurate reporting, certainly presently and going forward, you've got to be very, very careful, even if you don't go back and amend a grant, for instance, that's already expired. Keep in mind that the US government can go back at least 5 years, and in tax cases, 6 years on the statute of limitations on these cases, okay? And under the conspiracy statute can even reach back to beyond 5 or 6 years in terms of conduct. So something you might have done in 2012, you might think, oh, it's outside the statute of limitations. I didn't do anything wrong. Or if I did, they can't get me because it's outside the statute. A creative, aggressive, innovative prosecutor may be able to find a way to go back in time and catch you for acts that were more than 5 or 6 years ago.
All right, thanks. Here's a question. If being appointed as a chair professor in a Chinese university, which typically require to work, let's say 2 months every year, and as you probably know, most of the professors have academic salary, but also summer salary. If they don't take summer salary and take this 2 months of appointment in the Chinese universities, this activity counted as employment outside of the university?
Well, it depends on how the university would define it, but yeah, it could be, yes. And it's got to be disclosed. And a lot of these 1,000 talents contracts will say, hey, we want you to come over for 6 months. And the scholar will say, I can come over for 2 weeks. Okay, so the contract says 6 months. The professor says, I'll come for 2 weeks during my summer vacation, do the 2 weeks. But the contract looks like you're not disclosing that you've agreed to do 6 months a year over in China in exchange for $50,000. Okay, so you've got to make sure your paperwork is accurate. You've got to clarify and make sure the Chinese side is reporting accurately as well. and is consistent with your disclosures in the United States to your university or your federal funding agency.
Yeah, I think a good way is to actually sign a MOU with your university and the Chinese university. That's a better way to deal with this. So here's an interesting question. If I taught in the past a summer course at a Chinese military institute, this course was taught by several other Caucasian American faculty as well. Am I in trouble?
Well, I think the government would say teaching at a foreign institution is not per se illegal. If you're invited, you're providing information that's been vetted, is not violative of any of the export control statutes or anything like that. And you might even be able to accept an honorarium for it if you're disclosing it, if you have an obligation to disclose. If you're not disclosing it and hiding it, not paying your taxes on it, whatever, that's what gets you in trouble. Keep in mind, the DOJ would say to you, I would think, being a 1,000 talent scholar is not per se illegal, okay? But the ultimate purpose of the DOJ China initiative is to discourage many of the people in this program here not to have any connections with China. And again, the ultimate irony here is twofold. One is many of the academics listening to this program were encouraged by their employer to develop these relationships with Chinese institutions, many times in the name of fostering research, right? And it's frustrating to both the schools and the academics and the researchers that now those collaborations are being undermined for the greater good of society and the world, particularly in the bio-life sciences. And so you have that problem where, again, ultimately, I won't say it's a sinister objective. It's an objective of the US government to deter and discourage, if you will, academics, Chinese and Caucasian or whatever, from having links with China. And that's counter and clashes with academia and researchers' general goal of wanting to collaborate with whoever around the world so you can get advances in science. So there's a natural tension here as the US and China gets into what I call this new Cold War. You know, who's going to have the supremacy in artificial intelligence or drone technology? And if the Chinese, or what's that technology where, yeah, AI, where you can drive a car without driving it, right? I mean, who's going to control that technology or be the leading country in that technology? And interestingly enough, some of the top scientists in this space in the world are Chinese Americans. And the last thing the US government should want is to chase these people back to China so China can get this technology for themselves and lead the world in this space. I mean, this is this tension here and the misplaced focus of the China initiative that many of you need to step up and speak about and talk to your Board of Regents and Trustees about and talk to the Congress about, et cetera, and talk to the Department of Justice. And in the same breath say, we're not saying don't go after the people really trying to do espionage. We want them prosecuted too, you know? But don't go after the academics who are just doing what their institutions want them to do, or who by nature, by their intuitive training, want to collaborate with other people for the greater advancement of science, right? And that's what you need to think about as you're doing this and getting involved and talking to your colleagues about what's going on in the world today.
Yeah, Brian, that's great. Actually, on that point, you know, at least in biomedicine, right? We used to think, at least the science in biomedicine is without boundary because we're, you know, doing our best to advance the therapies, right? To understand the biology, advance therapies that will benefit the entire world, right? And at the same time, we also want to attract the, you know, the most talented students, postdocs, and it just happened to be 20–30% of those who come from China, right? This is the reason why, right? There's a lot of communication, collaboration between not only just Chinese American professors, but other professors from other races, heavily engaged with Chinese universities for collaboration to move the science forward, but also to attract the best students postdocs, right? So,
right. And
a question from the audience is, should we stop that? That seems to be not to the best interest of this country.
listen, some of you may recall that some months ago, the Trump administration during the pandemic tried to promulgate a rule that said the visas of foreign students would be revoked if they didn't physically attend classes at the academic institutions that they were engaging in studies, including postdocs. And it was an anti-Chinese measure, as well as a COVID measure by President Trump to force people to go back to school. But a number of Asian American organizations, including Committee of 100 and others that I belong to, were ready to go and file amicus briefs along with and joining with MIT and Harvard to try to block the promulgation of that reg that targeted 30 or 40%, 30%, I think, of the foreign students in the US are Chinese. And it would have completely stopped the flow of these postdocs and would have sent them home. These valuable, brilliant young people you're talking about, the government is trying to stop from coming to study if that regulation had been promulgated. And fortunately, the Trump administration withdrew that reg when MIT and Harvard and a number of institutions around the country, including USC and others, stepped up and said, we're gonna fight this, okay? Now, there was one of my slides involving Ms. Tang, the People's Liberation Air Force person who worked in a People's Liberation Hospital, Army hospital, who they said they accused of visa fraud and are prosecuting, I think, in Sacramento. This is an example of how Chinese postdocs are not going to want to come to the country if maybe they did 2 years military service in PLA, and now they're going to say, oh, I'm going to come here and get persecuted by the United States government because I did some military service, which a lot of people are required to do in China. Okay. This is going to stem the flow of postdocs. And you know where these postdocs are going to go? They're going to go to either stay in China, or they're going to go to Germany. They're going to France. They're going to go to Russia. They're going to go to other places where they're going to be made more welcome. And what we're going to do is we're going to lose the Chen Shens, the Werner von Brauns. We're going to lose the Enrico Fermis. We're going to lose some of these brilliant people who would come to the United States and want to study and develop nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, all right, all that stuff. And we're going to lose them to foreign countries. So we have to find a way to fight back and get these people to come over, and have this next generation of the people that are on this call. Many of the people on this call are immigrants from China, people who came over here after getting maybe an undergrad degree at Tsinghua, Beida, and then now came over here and got a postgrad degree in whatever. Eric Yuan from Zoom, an excellent example, okay? Who would have wanted Eric Yuan to stay in China and do Zoom from China, okay? That's an example I would make as part of what we need to message to the US government about why some of these policies are misplaced, misdirected. And what does it all relate to? It relates to this perception that we aren't as loyal as everybody else because we are more susceptible to recruitment by the Chinese Ministry of State Security, also known as the MSS, that they will come and subvert me or subvert you and give sensitive technology to the motherland, as the FBI likes to call it, okay? So that's what we're dealing with here.
Great, Brian. So on that point, how can we undo the damage made by the China initiatives already? And besides donating monies to these cases politically, what can we do to help these Chinese American scientists?
Well, there are many organizations starting now to galvanize, particularly with the change of administrations. You should know that in the prior administration, there was some effort made to meet with the OTSP, Office of Technology Policy, which now has cabinet level rank under the Biden administration, efforts made to talk to the State Department, to the Justice Department, and groups and within the government about the unfairness of these investigations. And most of it pretty much fell on deaf ears because in the view of many, and you should know this is not just a Republican versus Democrat thing. There are plenty of Democrats who take a very similar view that China is a very serious national security threat, okay? And you know, you have as many hawks within the national security establishment of the Democrats who will say that China is a big threat. So you have to understand that going in. But we hope that there'll be some more willingness to listen to some of the arguments I've espoused here tonight, because of the realization that nobody wants to lose this wonderful talent that we have and the talent we can attract, because the generation of immigrants like yourself and others are crucial to us continuing to get the best and the brightest to the United States of America, okay? And, you know, I urge everybody here to look up the Webster definition of patriot, which is a term often used by the media and the right and the left about loyalty and all that, and ask yourself, why aren't people considering us patriots just like the farmer guy from Nebraska, okay? Is it because of how we look? Is it because we all came from a communist country that the United States figures is a big time enemy of us? Whatever it is, we have to convince people that we are loyal Americans. We're committed to doing and continuing to make America great, like David Ho and Jerry Yang and Steve Chen, Yo-Yo Ma. I didn't put Yo-Yo in there, I should have, and the music and arts. We make great contributions to what makes America great, and we need to go and do that in the Congress and ask for hearings, okay, in Congress from the civil rights and the national security committees. We need to go, or intelligence committees. You need to go to the Justice Department and talk to its leaders, its new leaders. You need to talk to the White House, because now the science people have cabinet level rank. And many of you know Eric Lander, or some of you do, and you got to organize. And the Committee of 100, UCA, OCA, AAJ, a number of organizations are working together to do that. And the professional organizations, the co-sponsors of this seminar, need to join that cause, because without you, I'm not sure we can prevail, okay? So that's why sometimes when I do these seminars, I call it a call to arms. But you know, here's what I say to people, okay? You do it, if you don't do it for the community, or you don't do it for yourself, do it for your children. Do it for your children, because they're going to grow up in an America that has a view of Chinese Americans the way Steve Bannon or Hollywood would portray us. And it's not accurate, okay? 20-something years, almost 28 years ago, 27, 28 years ago, I was a much younger lawyer. I testified before the Congress when I was president of NAPABA, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. And I was testifying at the confirmation hearing of then nominated Justice Stephen Breyer, who's a senior justice on the court now. And while NAPABA and the other organizations of color, the African Americans and the Hispanics and the Indians, all said, look, we don't oppose the nomination of Judge Breyer to be a justice, but we think the court needs to have more diversity and color. And I don't want my son or daughter coming back here 20, 30 years later and saying to you, why isn't there an Asian American on the Supreme Court? Well, now it's almost 30 years since I testified. There's still no Asian American, no Chinese American on the US Supreme Court. Okay, and I'm going to leave it to my daughter to go up before the Supreme Court. I mean, go before some Congress when she's old enough. She's 12 now, but hopefully she'll be sooner, to go and say, where's my Asian Supreme Court justice? Do it for your children if you don't do it for yourself or your family, okay? Because they grow up in this environment. and history repeats itself. And if people don't step up and make noise and go to your trustees and go to your fellow faculty members and organizations and speak up, it's going to repeat itself. And your children will be giving this seminar to the next generation 20 years from now when the next controversy comes along.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think the message is really to do it for your children. I think all of us have our family here, our kids were born or grew up here, and we'll have to do something for their future as well.
Look, I can't tell you which professor, I don't think I should, but after he was charged, his kids were bullied at school, okay?
Of course.
Bullshit we have to deal with.
Yes. So there's some questions, really legal questions. I hope you have some time to help answer to our audience. So the first one is, are there websites, database for lawyers specialized in defending against such charges? You listed, you flash a slide, but I assume
you'll find a way to either through the internet or through the websites or whatever to get not only the names of the people on these slides, but the AAJ referral network, sort of like a hotline. You call up AAJ, they might be able to refer you a lawyer. I field a lot of calls. So there are some professors who have tuned in here that I know are people I've spoken to and tried to guide over the years. So we'll help you. And believe it or not, don't wait, because when Lee waited too long, a lot of the professors who've been charged waited too long before they sought legal counsel, and they paid a price because they said or did stupid things without talking to their lawyer. I can't tell you how frustrating it is for guys like me who do this work to talk to a professor who, has said, well, yeah, I thought I could explain it because I'm being honest. And next thing you know, the government has played gotcha and says they lied about something. Okay.
So to the audience, that one main sort of a reason we started to start this forum was really try to figure out a way to provide the legal help to everybody. So we're probably going to have a list of names provided by Brian, his colleagues, and we're going to send to everybody on our email list, or at least put on our website so you can seek for help. So the second question on this part is, if contacted by FBI, what are our rights and the best practice when inquired by CBP or FBI officers?
Well, look, most criminal defense lawyers would say, happy to talk with you, happy to cooperate with you, but I think maybe I would like to talk to my university counsel or a lawyer before we talk further about substantive stuff. And I would say that it's not just the FBI. It could be an NIH IG investigator, Inspector General investigator, NSF, NASA, DOE, Department of Energy. It could be an investigator who's not even with the FBI, who knocks on your door on campus and says, can I chat with you for a few minutes? And you should be careful, particularly if you have China talent, foreign, 1,000 talent ties and all that. It's always prudent to say, hey, I'm more than willing to chat and talk with you, but I probably may be prudent for me to talk to a lawyer before I talk to you, and that's probably the best thing you should do. It's being safe, cautious, but practical. You haven't hurt yourself by saying just, I want to talk to a lawyer first. The agent who might be aggressive might say, don't worry about it. You don't need a lawyer. I just have a few questions, just want to confirm a few things, try to get you to chat. That's what their job is. My general practice would be to say, go contact a lawyer first. Make sure you know where all the landmines are before you reach back to the investigator.
I see. So does a researcher, what's the next, well, let's say what's going to happen next? You're going to talk to your university counsel, and then the FBI will come back, and you're going to talk to them in the presence of your lawyer, or?
Well, remember that the university counsel might have a conflict. In most of the cases we've seen, the university council, of course, is looking after the university, not the faculty member. So you have to be careful what you share with them. Because if you say, well, let's say the guy's name is John, the university lawyer. John, I have a foreign bank account and I got about $20,000 from one of the 1,000 talent programs in there and I didn't tell anybody about it. That lawyer, John, unless he gives you the upjohn warning, he's not your lawyer, okay? And you give him the information thinking he's your lawyer, even after he gives you the upjohn warning, he can take that information and give it to the government and they can use that as a confession or admission against you. So you have to be careful what you say to university council. Or if university council determines that you have a conflict with the university because you have some stuff that maybe is not kosher on your forms, he or she you should ask them whether or not you should get separate counsel from the university who can represent you, the faculty member only, okay? And there are instances where some institutions, such as MIT and others, have actually gotten lawyers for the faculty members and paid their legal fees and indemnified them, meaning they paid their legal fees for these lawyers to give the professors separate advice, because while the university and the professor's interests might be common and they may share a common interest on some things they might have a conflict, like the university being threatened with losing federal funding for that whole department. And they may feel like, okay, we better get the guy a separate lawyer because we may need to throw him under the bus to save our funding for that department, okay? Right. So that's on the PowerPoint slide about steps you should take to try to figure out whether or not the university is going to support you or not.
Thanks, Brian. So here's a question. If the US government wrongly charged the Chinese American professor in US, is there any accountability for the damage?
Well, it's very hard to sue the United States government after you're vindicated. Professor Shui, as I said, has had the courage to take on the government in a lawsuit trying to get accountability for what happened to him. Chen is still seeking reinstatement and vindication civilly after her case was dismissed. It's a very long, hard, arduous, torturous endeavor to seek redress. There are some statutes that say if the government criminally prosecutes you wrongfully, you can sue under what they call the Hyde Amendment and seek your legal fees and damages back. But these are very rare cases and hard to win, honestly.
So if you see a group of such events, let's say 10, 20 of those, could your organization or some sort of organization sue the government on behalf of all these people suffered?
You could conceivably come up with a theory. It'd be very hard to win probably because each case is different. And if you wanted to do a class, you'd have to try to show similarities in the cases. And what you might be getting at is whether or not there's a racial profiling angle here, right, which I think in the criminal cases, there are some motions that can be brought in the criminal cases on what we call selective prosecution, okay? So there are legal defenses that you can consult with your criminal lawyer about in this space. I think some of these cases involving some of the professors who are currently charged, the government's going to end up having to deal with motions like that, okay? In the Wen-Ho Lee case over 20 years ago, the criminal lawyers brought a motion for discovery, meaning to seek documents from the government, regarding selective prosecution and racial profiling. And the judge ordered the government to respond to that discovery. And that motion was joined in by numerous community groups that joined in on that endeavor. And in some of these criminal cases, community organizations may have the same opportunity to join in and file what we call amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, where they say to the Judge, look, we as a community or have interests in this issue, we file a legal brief in support of the defendant's motion for selective prosecution or discovery on racial profiling because we think it impacts our community or the interests of our organization. So that's another way for you as groups to organize, raise some money to pay lawyers or get lawyers to volunteer to file pro bono wise amicus briefs to support these professors in their fight with the US government on trying to beat back some of the theories the government's been espousing, as well as getting under the government's sheets, if you will, and looking at seeing what has been motivating them to bring these cases and what's the criteria. And I wouldn't be surprised if part of the criteria was look at every Chinese American faculty member at a major institution, research institution, or major STEM area, and see if they have any Thousand Talents ties.
Right. So actually, I think to clarify a little bit, let's see, well, we also saw the news that Professor Chen filed this complaint yesterday, and also this case of Professor Tao try to fight his case. What's the consequences if they won these sort of complaints or these cases?
Well, I am hesitant to opine about specific cases, so I'm not. But I think I'll say that there's, as part of the defense process, you file all kinds of motions. Sometimes they're directed at the government's conduct. Sometimes it's directed at the legal underpinnings of the government's prosecution theory, as Professor Tao has done. And again, I don't want to talk too much about these theories. It's very legally technical, but it is part of the defense effort to bring motions challenging various things that either the government did or didn't do, or the legal theories that they're bringing, or the manner in which they investigated the case. In some cases, there are examples of misconduct by the government or mistakes by the government in how they conducted search warrants and things like that. So that's part of the defense lawyer's process that you have to talk to your defense lawyer about to try to challenge a government prosecution. And again, it's hard for me to be specific about a case. So I just would say that get a good lawyer, and if you take some of the lessons from tonight's seminar and avoid having to see people like me and not get charged my exorbitant hourly rate, which you'll choke on if you know what it is, you can avoid a lot of this anxiety that comes with these cases.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate. There are just too many questions. I can hardly follow. But the good news is we're hoping to have more speakers in the future, including we're hoping to get people from, as I said, the government branches, and also individuals who have suffered through these litigation processes to speak to this community. There are actually some questions. Could the slides be shared after the talk, Brian? I think it's up to you. We'll probably can figure out later if we want to share some of your slides.
Yeah, let me talk to people about it. I have to probably talk to other people and get permission.
Exactly.
PowerPoint.
Questions about
but look, the information on that PowerPoint anybody can give. So whether you get the actual slide, I can get you the information.
Right. Yeah, I think there might be ways that the forum can organize the information out of the slides that we can distribute to the community. And then there are also news media ask, could they use footage from the talk for editorial purposes? I'm not sure. Probably not.
Well, I think someone told me this was being blasted out on YouTube, so I think it may be a little late for that.
Well, as I said, everything.
Those who have heard me talk know that I can be even more outspoken, and I'm given to sometimes using aggressive language. So I tried to temper my remarks tonight, okay, for the benefit of the group. I hope I still got the message across. And if media wants to contact me, they can directly. That's better. I generally don't like to be in the media and the press on these cases. I'd rather just talk to the people who are impacted, you know, and then let others. go on the news.
Yeah,
So
understand.
that's basically my practice.
Yeah, again, there are many, many questions. I want to really thank everybody for participating in today's webinar, and we're going to save these questions, and we're going to hopefully answer or help you with these questions in the future webinars. Thank you, Brian, again, for your time and your efforts and everything you've done so far. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody tonight. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, everyone.